They laughed when he said it. Laughed like it was a toast, not a verdict. Cora, my father announced into the mic, the ballroom lights catching the silver in his hair, you will not be getting any inheritance. Forks froze midair. Someone choked on a cherry tomato. A violinist in the corner missed a note. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I lifted my glass and took a slow sip because what he said in public had always been the thing he practiced in private. Before we go on, if stories about justice, healing, and poetic payback are your thing, hit subscribe to Revenge with John and tell me in the comments. What would you do if your father cut you out in front of everyone? My name is Cora Hale. I am 40 years old. And for most of my life, I have been treated like a rumor in my own family. My earliest clear memory is not a birthday or a bicycle. It is a ledger. Dad kept one on the kitchen desk, a fat book that smelled like ink and lemon oil. When I was 6, I would climb onto the stool and trace the columns with my finger while he entered numbers after dinner. Costs go here, he'd say, tapping the left column, and real value goes here, tapping the right. Real value in his mouth always meant something that belonged to my brother Cole. Trophies, scholarships, potential. When I drew a picture of a circuit I didn't yet know to call a circuit, he patted my head. That's nice, honey, he said and flipped the page. My mother tried in the way that women of her generation thought was trying. She taught me how to starch a collar, how to plate a roast, how to clean ironed pleats with a toothbrush. Men notice details, she'd whisper, and they reward them. She meant husbands. I heard bosses. Cole was 2 years older and lived under a stage light that never went out. If he wanted cleats, he got cleats. If he wanted a car, he got keys pressed into his palm with an offhand "don't wreck it." If I wanted a summer program at the community college that offered robotics on Tuesday nights, Dad sighed like the request was a pebble in his shoe. Why would you want that, Cora? Because it makes sense in my head. He looked at me the way he looked at unbalanced columns, annoyed that something refused to line up. At 13 I won a county science fair with a messy, brilliant thing that counted light in a dark box and spit out numbers like secrets. The ribbon hung on my closet door until the tape turned brittle. Dad never asked how I made it. He did, however, mount Cole's junior varsity plaque in the living room. Guests should see what matters, he explained, and I learned I had to become something guests could not ignore. You're probably wondering why I stayed, why any of us stay in houses that shrink us. Because not all cages have bars. Some have last names. And sometimes the only way out is to grow bigger than the lock. By the time I was 18 I could tie a Windsor knot, draft a business memo that sounded like it was written by a man twice my age, and rebuild a motherboard from the junk drawer. I left for college on a scholarship Dad described as a nice surprise. He shook my hand at the door like I was a vendor who'd delivered under budget. Don't make a fool of yourself, he said. I handed him a folder with my dorm address and emergency numbers. He didn't open it. The first week of classes I sold my blood to buy a used laptop that had a cracked hinge but a courageous soul. I sat in the back row and took notes like a court stenographer at the trial of my old life. Professor Meyer's voice threaded through networks and protocols and the quiet gossip of machines. The world, it turned out, was not a ledger, and value did not have to be argued in a dining room to exist. I worked nights. I answered help desk tickets in a windowless basement that smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. On weekends I fixed printers nobody loved anymore, and people handed me cash with the grateful eyes of the newly pardoned. I noticed patterns. Calls clustered at quarter close, outages spiked the day after security patches. I started sketching a service that predicted failure the way a sailor tastes rain before the clouds turn. Cole visited once, flanked by 2 fraternity brothers who wore their polo collars like halos. He brought me a box of cookies our mother baked and a list of things Dad thought I should be doing. Join a sorority, choose an easier major, keep smiling. When I showed him my code he squinted at the screen. That looks hard, he said like a diagnosis. Hard is a compliment, I replied. He shrugged. Dad says you overthink everything. By 22 I had a draft, bad, brilliant, stubborn. By 24 I had a prototype that predicted server failures with a confidence interval Professor Meyer actually whistled at. You've built a weather report for machines, he said, and pulled a chair up beside me like a father might have done in another universe. I didn't tell my family. The silence wasn't fear. It was strategy. I had learned that some victories grow in the dark just fine. The first checks were small, angel money that came with breath mints and coffee stains. I took none of it for granted. Every dollar had a job. I slept on floors, ate noodles I could count in my hand, Learn the difference between stubbornness and grit by confusing them often and paying the tax on the mistake. When a client called crying because her system had crashed during payroll, I stayed up for 30 hours and wrote a patch that would have made my 13-year-old self dance in sock feet down the hall. He sent tulips. I dried them between pages of a notebook where I kept a list titled People Who Saw Me. Strange thing, when money starts to pay attention to you, so do people who never used to. An investor who once called me sweetheart on a panel began CCing me on emails as Founder Hale. A reporter who told me my idea was cute asked for an interview before this gets big. It did get big. Clients multiplied. Charts curved the way you want them to. We hired. We grew. We learned to be generous without being naive. I kept my last name quiet in the press. Hale is common enough to be a shadow. I did not hide so much as decline to perform. If you've ever been told to smile, sweetheart, while debugging a nightmare at 2 a.m., you'll understand why the anonymity felt like a heat shield. A few years later, the first acquisition offer landed on my desk with enough zeros to make the table feel unsteady. I didn't frame it. I didn't call home. I folded it in half and slid it into a folder labeled Temptations. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say not yet to a door that everybody wants you to walk through. My father aged into a man who wore his achievement like a perfectly tailored suit. He built his construction business from a garage and a borrowed drill. For that, I respected him deeply. But he believed the world he conquered was the world, and that any path not paved with concrete wasn't a path at all. We saw each other on holidays where conversations were shaped like interviews. How's school? Even after I'd graduated. How's your little computer thing? Even after I'd raced a Series B. If I said busy, he said, careful. If I said good, he said, don't get cocky. I don't think he knew those were the only prayers he knew how to say. The invitation to his retirement party arrived on thick paper that felt like wealth between your fingers. Gold embossing. A ballroom address. A note in his tidy accountant's script. Would love to see you there. No heart, no exclamation point, but then again, ledger men don't use punctuation for feeling. I put the card on my fridge with a magnet shaped like a rocket. For 3 days I ignored it. On the 4th, I found myself staring at it the way you stare at a mountain you keep insisting you don't want to climb. Why go? Why stand in a room built for a version of success that never made room for me? Why listen to a highlight reel narrated by a man who believed daughters were supporting characters? Because some rooms are chapters. And some chapters are doors. And some doors only open if you walk back through them with a different spine. RSVP'd yes. The week before the party, my general counsel sent over final paperwork on something most people in my life didn't know existed. The foundation I'd been building quietly for years. A funnel for the money that felt too loud in my hands. It focused on women who were told no by men who managed ledgers and forgot miracles. It gave grants to founders in second-tier cities whose ideas were too gritty for glossy decks. It funded emergency childcare for women pitching VCs who frowned at diaper bags. It wrote checks the way my mother once wrote grocery lists. Practical, loving, sure. Do we announce this at the end of the quarter? My counsel asked on the phone. Or hold it for a bigger narrative moment. I thought about Dad's ledger and my 13-year-old light counter and the plaque in the living room that used to swallow sunlight. Hold it, I said, and heard in my own voice the calm of a storm that knows exactly where it is going to land. On the morning of the party, I stood in my closet longer than the choice of a dress deserved. It wasn't vanity. It was armor. Blue, I decided, powerful without shouting. Under the hem, I tucked a small envelope into the inner pocket I had asked my tailor to sew months ago, long before the invitation arrived. The paper was heavy. The ink smelled like decision. When I zipped the dress, I caught my own eye in the mirror and almost didn't recognize her. Not because she looked different. Because she looked the same but unafraid. I arrived late enough to be noticed and early enough to be accused of being on time. The ballroom was warm with money and nostalgia. Old colleagues clapped Dad on the shoulder and told stories that felt rehearsed from being told so often. Cole stood near the bar regaling a cluster of men with a tale about a deal he'd closed that sounded more like a dare he'd won. He saw me, lifted his glass and mouthed, "Wow, you came." I smiled. I didn't say you have no idea why. The MC tapped the mic, the room dimmed, the slideshow began. Dad young and grinning, Dad in a hard hat, Dad shaking hands with men whose names would be carved into plaques long after their handshake meant anything. People laughed at the right places. They sighed at the right ones too. It's easy to worship a story when you only hear it from one pulpit. When Dad finally took the stage, he looked larger than the man who taught me where costs and value go. He adjusted the mic and cleared his throat. "Tonight," he began, "we honor work." He talked about grit and risk and luck said without ever calling it luck. He thanked his crew, his partners, his clients. He thanked my mother for building a home I could come back to. He thanked Cole for stepping up. He glanced toward me once, a quick look that slid off like rain on wax. "And as we move this company to its next chapter," he said, "we'll be keeping the family legacy tight where it belongs." The line I knew was coming arrived on cue, dressed like a compliment delivered by a knife. "As for my daughter Cora, she's taken a different path and I wish her well, but she won't be receiving any inheritance." Laughter skittered across the floor like dropped silverware. I lifted my glass and tasted the quiet that comes just before lightning. Across the room, the MC's hand hovered over the mic, uncertain if he should take it back. Tables turned toward me the way flowers tilt toward sun. Somewhere in the back, a camera's red eye blinked awake. I stood up, smoothed the blue of my dress, and felt the envelope tap against my hip like a heartbeat. "May I said, my voice steady as a plumb line, and reached for the microphone. The weight of the microphone was familiar, though I'd never held one in this kind of room before. I had presented to venture capitalists, to boards, to rooms that smelled like coffee and fear. But this was different. This was family. This was history staring back at me in tailored suits and raised eyebrows. My father didn't sit down right away. He lingered at the podium like a landlord unsure whether to evict a tenant or let them explain the noise complaint. His jaw flexed once, the way it always did when he was calculating risk. I smiled at him, not with defiance, but with the calm of someone who no longer asks permission to exist. "Thank you," I said, my voice cutting through the ballroom chatter like a violin's first clean note. I wasn't scheduled to speak tonight, but then again I was never scheduled in this family either. A few gasps fluttered around the tables. Cole laughed under his breath, shaking his head like I was proving Dad right, the dramatic sister. But others leaned forward. They wanted to hear what the invisible daughter had to say. "I grew up in the shadow of a ledger," I continued, turning toward the crowd. "My father balanced costs and value on paper, but he also did it at the dinner table. Cole's trophies went on the wall. My science fair ribbons went in a drawer. Cole's choices were investments. Mine were indulgences. And somewhere along the way, I decided if my family wouldn't keep score for me, I'd write my own scoreboard." My father finally sat down. He crossed his arms like armor. The expression on his face said get it over with. But his eyes, they betrayed something else. A flicker of unease. I could feel the silence ripening, stretching. A ballroom trained to clap on cue now held its breath, waiting. I thought of all the years when my voice was a faint sound in a loud household, and how tonight it filled the rafters. "I built something," I said simply. Not because I was given a head start, but because I was told not to run at all. And tonight, while we celebrate my father's retirement and the legacy of this company, I want to talk about another kind of legacy. At the word legacy, heads turned sharply. That word had been the password all night. The family business, the inheritance, the future tied up in contracts and shares. To hear it in my mouth was unsettling, like a stranger suddenly speaking your dialect. I let them wonder. I let them wait. Cole tried to interrupt with a loud, dismissive clap, as though to rescue me from myself. But I raised a hand slightly and the room hushed again. Strange power that, how easily silence obeys a voice it has ignored for decades. "The truth is," I said, "I don't need an inheritance. I've already inherited enough. The doubt, the dismissals, the underestimation. They were heavy, but they were fuel. And I've used them well." Murmurs rippled. Guests glanced at my father, then back at me. Some looked uncomfortable, others intrigued. The press photographers began snapping in earnest now, sensing a headline. And then I decided to let them glimpse the edge of the secret I had carried for years. In my work, I've met women just like me, told they weren't enough, told they didn't belong, told their ambition was arrogance. And I realized, our inheritance can't just be money from those who came before us. It has to be opportunities for those who come after us. There was a pause. A pause pregnant with disbelief, confusion, curiosity. I could feel my father stiffen, certain I was about to shame him further. But what he didn't know was that this wasn't about revenge in the way he understood revenge. This was about redefining the scoreboard he had always kept. The MC hovered nervously by the side of the stage, but no one moved to take the microphone away. In fact, some guests leaned forward like students at the front of a classroom. For the first time in my life, I had their undivided attention. And then, slowly, deliberately, I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress. My hand brushed the envelope. Its edges were sharp, almost ceremonial. Inside was a truth that would rewrite the night. I let my fingers rest there. Not yet, I thought. Not here, not this second. Because the sweetest victories are not loud. They're timed. I closed the speech with a smile that surprised even me. For tonight, I'll just say this: thank you for listening. It means more than you know. I set the mic down gently, like a judge setting down a gavel. The applause was hesitant, uneven, but it was there. And in that scattered clapping, I heard something new, the sound of a family's narrative beginning to crack. As I returned to my seat, I caught my father's eyes. There was no laughter now. Only calculation. He had no idea that the envelope at my side carried not a plea for recognition, but a revelation that would make his announcement look like a footnote in history. The applause faded like a nervous laugh, and chatter picked up again. Glasses clinking, forks scratching porcelain, guests leaning toward each other to whisper about what the forgotten daughter had just done. But my father wasn't whispering. He sat stone still, his arms folded tight across his chest, jaw locked. The kind of silence that wasn't passive. It was war. I pretended not to notice. I cut into my steak, nodded at the waiter refilling my glass, and let the weight of the envelope at my side remind me why I was here. It wasn't just to answer him. It was to end a story that had been written without me for far too long. The night stretched on. Speeches turned into toasts. Old colleagues swapped stories about construction sites and deals closed decades ago. Cole basked in the spotlight, grinning as people clapped him on the back. He'd been introduced as the future of the Hale Company. And then the MC announced, "We'll close tonight with a toast to legacy." A perfect cue. I felt the envelope burning against my hip like it had a pulse. I rose from my seat slowly. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying farther than I expected. "Before we end the night, I'd like to share something." The MC froze. My father's head snapped toward me, his glare sharp enough to cut glass. But I walked back to the podium anyway, the envelope in my hand. "This evening we've heard a lot about legacy," I began. I held the envelope high enough for everyone to see. My father spoke about inheritance. What's given, what's withheld. But tonight I'd like to show you what inheritance can become when you stop waiting for permission to claim it. A ripple went through the crowd. Phones were raised now, cameras clicking. Cole muttered something under his breath. I opened the envelope, slid the document free, and placed it flat on the podium so the microphones could catch the sound of paper against wood. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is confirmation of a donation made tonight in my father's name." I let the pause hang long enough for them to lean in, hungry. An endowment of $100 million to the Hale Foundation for Women Entrepreneurs. An initiative I founded years ago, quietly, to give opportunities to those told they'd never belong at the table. Gasps. Murmurs. A chair clattered as someone stood too fast. I smiled. "Yes, 100 million. Tonight in his honor." The room erupted, not with applause, not yet, but with shock. Reporters surged forward. Guests stared at me, then at my father. Cole's jaw actually dropped, his glass tilting in his hand until champagne spilled down his sleeve. And my father? He didn't move. His face turned the color of unpolished steel, frozen between outrage and disbelief. He hadn't seen this coming, because he'd never looked at me long enough to imagine it could. I leaned closer to the mic. "Dad, you taught me to balance ledgers. Tonight I'm balancing something else. The weight of all those times you told me I wasn't enough. And I'm turning it into something bigger than both of us." Silence. Every eye in the room was on him. For the first time in my life, I wasn't his daughter in the shadows. I was the storm he hadn't forecast. The ballroom was no longer a ballroom. It was a courtroom, a newsroom, a battlefield. Every head was turned, every eye sharpened. The chandeliers hummed above like watchful witnesses. "Did she say 100 million? Someone near the dessert table whispered. "Impossible," another muttered, but their phone was already raised, recording. Reporters elbowed through the crowd, their camera flashes bursting like lightning. Cora Hale. Is it true? Where did the money come from? When was the foundation established?" Their voices overlapped until they sounded like static. Cole slammed his empty glass on the bar hard enough to rattle the bottles. She's lying, he barked. This is some stunt. His words slurred with indignation, though he wasn't drunk. Just furious. She can't have that kind of money. She's nothing. The crowd didn't laugh with him. Not this time. They stared. They stared at me. If your sibling called you nothing in front of hundreds, would you shout back, or would you let silence prove them wrong like I did? I didn't answer Cole. His rage only amplified his smallness. Instead, I straightened my shoulders and let the silence do its work. One by one the applause began, not from family but from strangers. A banker in a navy suit, a former mayor, a woman from the Chamber of Commerce. Then louder. Then unified. Until the ballroom that had once laughed at me was standing, clapping for me. My father didn't clap. He didn't stand. He sat rigid in his chair, arms crossed, his expression carved into stone. But I knew him too well not to see the fracture. His eyes betrayed him. Behind the rage there was something else. Pride. Unwanted, uninvited, but there. When the noise settled enough for words again, a reporter shouted over the clamor, "Cora, why donate in your father's name after he denied you his inheritance?" I smiled steady. "Because sometimes the best revenge," I said, "is turning what tried to break you into something that builds others." My father gave me nothing, and in that nothing I found everything I needed to build. Gasps. Murmurs. The scribbling of pens against notepads. Cole stormed toward me, his face red, his fists tight. "You think this makes you better than us? That you can humiliate Dad like this?" I didn't flinch. I leaned slightly into the microphone. I didn't humiliate him. I honored him, in the way he could never imagine I would. The words landed like a verdict. Cole stopped in his tracks. And in that moment I knew, my fight was no longer with my brother. It never had been. It was with the ghost of invisibility that had shadowed me my whole life. And tonight that ghost was finally gone. I stepped down from the podium. Cameras followed me, voices shouted, questions hurled. But I didn't need to say another word. Because the image was already burned into their eyes. The daughter they had dismissed, standing tall, applauded by strangers, and carrying a legacy her father never thought she'd claim. And in the corner of my eye I caught him, my father. For the briefest moment his lips curved. Not a smile. Not quite. But close enough to tell me something had shifted. Something between rage and respect. When I woke the next morning my phone was glowing like a lighthouse. Missed calls stacked in double digits. Messages flooded every app. Emails carried subject lines that blurred together. Interview request. Urgent. Feature opportunity. Please confirm. I sat up slowly, the hotel curtains leaking daylight into the room. For the first time in years I wasn't rushing to answer anyone. I let the world wait. Then I opened the news. Invisible daughter donates $100 million in father's name. Cora Hale, the heiress who needed no inheritance. The woman who redefined legacy overnight. Every outlet had a version. Photographs of me holding the envelope. Clips of my father's stone face. Cole's shocked expression frozen mid-protest. My name trended on social media. Not as someone's sister, not as someone's daughter, but as someone on her own. Back at my father's house the air was different. I wasn't there but I knew it as surely as if I had walked through the front door. Neighbors had seen the news. Business partners had called. Old friends sent congratulatory notes. Not to him but to me. And my father, who had built his life on the certainty that his son would inherit his throne while his daughter faded into silence, found himself staring at headlines where his name was tied to my act. Cole paced the living room, furious. "She humiliated us," he shouted, his voice bouncing off the oak-paneled walls. "She made you look weak, Dad. We have to fix this." But my father didn't answer immediately. He sat in his leather chair, staring at the morning paper spread across his knees. My photo smiled back at him above the headline. For the first time he saw me not as an afterthought but as a force. And that unsettled him more than Cole's rage ever could. Later that day my mother called. Her voice trembled. "Cora, the house phone hasn't stopped ringing. People keep saying they're proud of you. Proud of you, not your father, not Cole. You." She paused as though the word itself felt new on her tongue. "I don't know if he'll admit it, but your father is shaken. He doesn't know how to be angry at you when the world is clapping." I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. I didn't need his applause. But the image of him, silent with his newspaper torn between anger and pride, was sweeter than any inheritance could ever have been. Cole, however, wasn't torn. He was sharpening. That evening he stormed into a board meeting at the company headquarters, declaring that my donation was a PR stunt meant to overshadow the family business. He argued that the company needed to counter my act with its own legacy campaign. But not everyone nodded along this time. Some of the executives, men who had clapped for him all his life, were now murmuring about me. She's a visionary. Her foundation will bring more attention than any of our projects. Maybe she should have been part of this company after all. Cole saw it in their eyes, the shift. And envy ate at him like acid. That night I stepped onto my balcony overlooking the city skyline. My phone buzzed again with another interview request, another headline, another invitation to speak. But I didn't need to say anything yet. Because the world was already speaking for me. And my father, alone in his chair with his paper, was listening in ways he never had before. For the first time I felt not just visible, but undeniable. Envy is loud when it comes from Cole. He's never been able to keep his voice measured, never been able to swallow the bitterness that rises in his throat. And after that night, bitterness became his only language. By Monday morning I was everywhere. News anchors called me the daughter who rewrote legacy. Blogs praised the symbolism of a woman overlooked becoming the force everyone now looked to. And investors, people I hadn't spoken to in years, sent emails filled with congratulations and, more importantly, proposals. Cole couldn't stand it. Cole's first move was predictable. He called reporters. "She's exaggerating," he claimed. "There's no 100 million, it's smoke and mirrors." But the documents I had released were public. The bank statements, the endowment papers, the legal confirmation, all airtight. The more he shouted, the more foolish he looked. His second move was nastier. Anonymous tips began circulating. Cora's company is unstable. Cora underpays her staff. Cora bought her way in. But journalists digging into the claims came back with the opposite. Testimonials from my employees about fair pay, growth, and respect. Photos of women entrepreneurs I had funded, standing proudly in front of the businesses they built. The smear campaign backfired. Every attempt to tarnish my name only threw more light onto what I had done. Meanwhile, my father grew quieter. He stopped answering Cole's late-night rants. Stopped defending him in front of colleagues. At dinners, when Cole railed about me, Dad simply folded his napkin and stared into the distance. One evening my mother called again. "Your father doesn't say it," she whispered, "but he's been clipping every article about you. He keeps them in a folder in his study. He doesn't want Cole to see." I pictured him, an old man in a quiet office, slipping headlines into a drawer as if each one were a confession he wasn't ready to speak aloud. It didn't erase the years of neglect, but it planted something new. A seed of respect. Cole, however, was unraveling. At the next board meeting he slammed his fist on the table. "Are we seriously going to let her overshadow us? She's not even part of this company." But the directors exchanged glances he didn't like. One of them finally spoke. "Cora may not sit at this table, Cole. But she's already influencing more than we are. Perhaps it's time to rethink what the Hale name means." Cole stormed out red-faced. And in that moment he understood. I wasn't just a rival for my father's approval anymore. I was a rival for the Hale legacy itself. That night, as I reviewed plans for the foundation's next initiatives, funding startups in cities no one bothered to notice, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Cole could scream, could smear, could rage. But storms don't stop mountains from rising. And I had become the mountain he never saw coming. By spring, my name was no longer just a headline. It was a movement. The Hale Foundation had opened branches in 6 cities, funding women who had once been turned away with polite rejections. Newspapers called me the woman who made inheritance irrelevant. On television panels, I wasn't introduced as anyone's daughter or sister. I was simply Cora Hale. Cole seethed as my recognition grew. He called me a fraud, a thief, a parasite. But the world stopped listening. His words carried no weight anymore, not even in the boardroom. Clients began asking about me, not him. A legacy he thought was handed to him at birth was slipping through his fingers like sand. And my father grew smaller. Not in stature but in certainty. The man who had once spoken in declarative sentences now hesitated at commas. He clipped my interviews from the papers and hid them in his desk. When colleagues praised me, he only nodded. But behind his eyes, something softened. The confrontation came quietly. I visited their house on a Sunday afternoon, the same dining room where I had once balanced a ledger with my finger as a child. My father sat at the head of the table, his chair as rigid as the man himself. Cole wasn't there. He'd stormed off days earlier after another boardroom defeat. We ate in silence until he finally cleared his throat. "It surprised me," he said. His voice was rough, as though the words were stones dragged out from deep water. I set my fork down, waiting. "You made a name," he continued. His eyes met mine, steady but uncertain. "Not just for yourself. For this family." I almost laughed at the irony. He had disowned me in front of hundreds, and now the world tied his name to mine whether he liked it or not. But instead I only said, "No, Dad. I didn't do it for the family. I did it for me. And for the women who need to know that being dismissed isn't the end of their story." His mouth opened, then closed. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing he had ever given me to respect. As I left that night, my mother hugged me longer than she ever had. "He's proud of you," she whispered. "He just doesn't know how to say it." I didn't need him to. The world had already said it for him. His rage consumed him. The more he tried to drag me down, the more irrelevant he became. Investors pulled away, colleagues distanced themselves. His shadow shrank until it no longer touched me at all. I stood taller. Because I had learned that true inheritance isn't measured in dollars or titles. It's measured in the courage to build your own legacy when no one believes you can. So, when people ask me if that night at my father's retirement party was revenge, I smile. It was more than revenge. It was reclamation. It was healing. It was freedom. And in the quiet afterward, when the clapping faded and the lights dimmed, I realized something even sweeter. I no longer needed to be my father's daughter. I was simply Cora Hale, and that was enough.